So today we're going to be continuing this examination of the ego and its relationship with God, or the I-God line if you prefer. And we'll be talking about the three stages or three ways that came down through history as a simple synthesis of what many others had described. What this presents to us, these three stages, is a way, it sort of holds up a mirror to help us maybe get a sense of where we are in our relationship with God. And I had this question, which I know you just touched on, but you might just think about it after the group sharing you just had and Sister Jane's class. Just think in your own life, where you are now versus, let's say, where you were 10 or 20 years ago. How has God changed you for the better through the years? Can you see something that has changed in you as a result of a growing relationship with God? Just get in touch with that as we get started. Spirituality of the desert evolved into monastic spirituality. And as Sister Jane described, the big shift here was not so much a shift in terms of giving your life to God, but of doing so in community, with some kind of structure, some kind of order, especially the chanting of the Psalms, liturgical prayer, communal work, and so forth. But what you also had was more time for people to share about the spiritual life with each other. More time also for writing about the spiritual life. More formal attention given to spiritual direction and spiritual development. In every case, what's recognized here is the obstacle to our union with God is sin. Not ignorance in the sense of having incomplete knowledge, not age, not maturity. Some writers today suggest that these are the problem, is that we're just not mature. Sin is something else. It's a resistance to God. It's a mysterious power at work in the world and in our lives that moves us away from relationship with God and also corrupts our human relationships as well, even divides us within ourselves. Some sin is serious. The tradition came to identify two levels of sin, very serious sin that was called mortal sin. And so what I'm presenting here is the traditional understanding that came down through the monastic period. Mortal sin was considered mortal because it's deadly. Grave sin is another way of talking about it. It destroys the life of grace in the soul and separates one from God, usually as a result of a serious attachment to something, but it's also ratified by serious behavior in the service of that attachment. The three mortal sins in the early church were murder, apostasy, and adultery. If you committed those three sins, you were in serious trouble with God. And you could come back into full relationship with God, but you had to go through a practice of penance and eventually gain the forgiveness of your brothers and sisters in the Christian community. Now, the other level of sin, venial, is also offense against God, but not quite as serious. It's called venial because the soul still has the vital principle that allows a cure from within, similar to the healing of a sick or diseased person. Deliberate venial sin or habitual venial sin was considered serious in that it might make one more vulnerable to committing mortal sin. That's the basic insight about sin, separating us from God, very deadly sin. You find even reference to deadly sin in the epistles of St. John, that there are some whose sin is so deadly, he even says, don't even bother praying for some of these people. And as we know, some of that became codified, where this was venial sin, this was mortal sin. It became very legalistic. There became all these lists of sins that you were to reflect on before you went to confession and so forth. But still the insight that was originally, I guess, the original insight that there's very serious sin and serious sin that's not so serious is a good one to continue to recognize. was recognized that sin as this power at work in the world can begin very early in life. We can begin to be influenced by it very early in life. Recognize that sin also has a social dimension. It can become enculturated. Be careful what you pray for, ladies. The antidote to sin is God's grace working to transform human nature. Grace understood as God's help, God's life, the life of the Spirit. It was understood that there's a kind of life in us that's a natural life, that gives life to the body, the human body. Just because you're alive doesn't mean that's God's life. God's life is a particular kind of energy or life. The Greek word for it was zoe. It means spirit with a capital S. Love, we'll say, in other places. And it's not the same kind of life that gives life to the psyche either. And so God's grace, that uncreated energy of God, that is the Spirit, is what transforms our human nature and helps us to overcome sin. So that's sort of the context for the three ways or stages of growth that developed. It's against this backdrop of sin. If we didn't have sin in the world, well, who knows what things would look like. But we do have it. And so we struggle against this power in our own nature and in our communities as well. As far as we can tell, the first clear elaboration of the three ways came from a writer named Dionysius, also called Pseudo-Dionysius, in the 5th and 6th centuries. It's a further elaboration on Evagrius's three levels, praxis, physique, and theoria, that we talked about last time. It's been used widely since, accepted by Thomas Aquinas, John of the Cross, and many writers. It was taught in seminaries, probably, and still is in many places. It's not denying that there are unique patterns and issues for each person, but it's recognizing broad general patterns of spiritual development that are about our growth in grace. Teresa of Avila envisioned this as a movement into increasingly intimate places in the soul, which he envisions as an interior castle. So Teresa's 7 levels of 7 mansions in the interior castle corresponds to this, and we'll lay that out shortly as well. We begin by considering someone who is living a worldly life, governed by sinful desires and behaviors. Not necessarily a murderer, can seem a most ordinary person, but they're totally caught up in worldly values. These were understood to be sinners. Now, the term sinner, if you're a Catholic, means one who sins. And I remember a conversation I had with an evangelical years ago, and he asked me if I was a sinner. And I said, well, of course, we all are. He says, brother, I'm not. I said, well, yes, you are. He says, no, I'm not. For him, a sinner was one whose life was governed by sin. And I said, well, in that case, I guess I'm not. I still do sin, but sin doesn't rule my life, okay? So there's a different way of talking about the term sinner. So sinners are those who live outside of Teresa's castle, those whose lives are ruled by sin. Sort of like the distinction you might make between an alcoholic and one who drinks. Not all who drink are alcoholics, but alcoholics are those whose lives are destroyed in many cases by the drink. They're very much harmed by it. They can't handle it. It controls their lives. For Teresa, if you live outside the castle, you're living a carnal, worldly life. The will is very weak and unable to resist sin. The mind is deluded, filled with self-justification. The 7 deadly sins are rooted deeply in your nature, at least in your attitudes, often in your behavior as well. Nowadays, we'd say that the false self system is governing your life, and addictions and attachments are as well, most likely. Teresa of Avila has great descriptions about this in her books. A classical text called The Theology of Christian Perfection that I'll be referring to by Antonio Royo and Jordan Oman, both Dominicans. They talk about this as well. people in this stage consider mortal sin to be of little importance and something that is readily pardoned, doesn't matter much. And so they imprudently place themselves in all kinds of occasions of sin and succumb to temptation with the greatest facility. They sometimes undertake spiritual disciplines, but they excuse themselves from it very easily as well. That's a sinner. Who do we slap this label on? Well, obviously we have to be very careful about that. Only God knows who these sinners are. But usually, at least the descriptions given of sinners through the ages, they give you enough characteristics that when you come across one, if you're not one, your spirit will somewhat recoil or experience some sort of static or conflict when you're in the presence of a person whose life is so caught up by the power of sin. Do you ever have that happen? Yeah. And you might be moved to pray for them. You might be moved to dialogue with them about something. But you can just tell it's a real disturbance in their spirit. Well, thankfully, we don't stay there. We can move into the purgative stage through a process of conversion. Conversion is the turning away from the life of sin, the commitment to God, and living in God's way. And it is an ongoing process, though it may be marked by definitive turning points. There can be dramatic turnarounds, which William James called twice-born types. It can also be a gradual, ongoing process as well. The purgative way is the way or state of those who are beginners. And the term beginner can describe even a person who is, let's say, in the purgative stage in their 50s or 60s. Beginner just means that they're beginners in the spiritual life, in that they're not very far along in resisting the ways of sin and the world. They have obtained justification and the graces of salvation, but still have their passions governed to a great deal by the temptations to sin. They struggle with temptation, in other words. They strive to exercise charity and to practice spiritual discipline, but they find that a great struggle. And God does let us struggle, and God considers it important that we struggle. This point is made. Why doesn't God take us all the way into the unitive stage, the third stage? And St. Augustine, who was mentioned earlier today, answered, he says, God created us without us, but he did not will to save us without us. He wants us to cooperate in our own salvation, that we have to grow in this relationship with God by choosing relationship with God over the life of sin again and again. In the language of 12-step spirituality, which is dealing with this, many people who are caught up in addictions are moving into the purgative stage and are starting to work the 12 steps. One of the first pieces of advice they give is you have to change playgrounds and playmates if you're going to get anywhere. And so the church is supposed to be a place where we find a different society, a different community that provides support and an atmosphere for growth. Feeding the soul the milk of Scripture and community life. The practice of virtue is also very important at this stage. God often grants strong consolations to people in this stage to convince them of its rightness, to draw them to deeper love. But just as there are consolations, there are also desolations, ups and downs with God. There's a tendency in this stage to evaluate where one is with God according to how one feels. So there's a fluctuation of the heart and actions in the purgative stage, and sometimes even a backsliding, a going back down across the line, getting caught up in the old stuff again, then coming around again. But with persistent practice, the will is strengthened, the mind is strengthened, and eventually one will enter into another door. And again, I'm sharing you the traditional understanding and wisdom here. You can see how it fits with your experience. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That door is called the night of the senses, which we'll hear about in another class from Sister Renee when she talks about the dark nights. It's a passive purgation of the spirit of one's passions, of the affective system. It's as though God says, okay, I see you're putting up the good effort, You're making the effort. You're striving to live this life. You're making good progress. Now I'm going to do some things for you that you can't do for yourself. I'm going to heal you at a level that you can't touch or reach with your own willpower and your awareness. And the Night of the Senses does that. It heals the psyche in a way that enables us to come to a new freedom and enter into this next stage that they call the Illuminative stage, or Illuminative way. Now, when I say enter into, I don't mean we jump 100% from one into the other. As we'll talk about later, you can still have your feet in the world and in the Purgative way, and you can still see the light and experience the fruit of the Illuminative way. The Illuminative way is that of those who are in the state of progress. The formal word for them is progressives, and that's not in the current political sense, where that's a liberal political position. Progressives are those who have their passions better under control, so that they easily keep themselves from mortal sin, but who do not so easily avoid venial sins, because they still take pleasure in earthly things and allow their minds to be distracted by various imaginations and their hearts with numberless desires, though not in matters that are strictly unlawful. So they get caught up in all kind of stuff that's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't particularly lead you to God either. It is called the Illuminative way. Now this is very important, because in it the mind becomes more and more enlightened as to spiritual things and the practice of virtue. The mind becomes more and more capable of recognizing where God is at work in one's life. One is growing in wisdom and knowledge here. One is more steady in action, in resisting sin, in practicing virtue, but there are still fluctuations of the heart. The attitudes are being purified. One is experiencing what's called recollection. Now that's an important word. I want you to write that down. Recollection. I have it written somewhere here, I'm sure. Recollection means that the mind and will are oriented unto God. That's what recollection means. And recollection can be established through an active practice like, let's say, a good prayer period, and you leave prayer and you're really tuned into God, and you say, hot dog, I'm ready for the day. Let's go, Lord. You ever have a day like that? That's when you're in a state of recollection. Recollection, then, we would say, is active or acquired as a result of your spiritual practice. But in living the spiritual life, you can also come to what's called habitual recollection, where you're sort of habitually attuned to the ways of God through trying to live in the ways of God throughout the day. And then there's another kind called infused recollection that is the beginning of contemplative prayer. That's the Illuminative way, and I suspect there's a lot of Christians who live in this way, this Illuminative way. They're not drawn to mortal sin. They're not going to go there. They're serious about God. They're not going back into the world. They're not interested in that. That's sort of what the Illuminative way is. When you make decisions about your life, God comes into consideration. In your own self-understanding, God plays a role in your own self-understanding. God is not something that's there on a shelf to pull down every now and then. God is fundamental and important in your life, integral to who you are. How one answers the question, who am I, has something to do with God now. So that's the Illuminative way. One can begin in this stage to experience contemplative experiences more and more, times when we're just drawn to be with God in prayerful rest. And that's different for everyone. Now, if we continue with that, and especially continue with our spiritual practices and living this life faithfully, we could be drawn into, here he comes, the Night of the Spirit. This is St. John of the Cross's schema, where the Night of the Senses is purifying the psyche, the emotions, memories, and so forth. The Night of the Spirit is purifying the mind, our attitudes, the roots of our thinking. And one can experience desolations not simply of emotion, but of knowing, where we can feel like we don't know anything and haven't understood one blessed thing yet, where nothing makes sense. John of the Cross called this a spirit of dizziness. It's as though we're just not so confident in our beliefs anymore. And what is God doing then? He's calling us to a deeper level of trust. Trusting in God, and it's not that we abandon our beliefs. It's just that we don't feel that they are the means by which we're connecting with God anymore. It's going to be a deeper spirit-to-spirit connection. And God draws us then into the unitive stage. And this was called the state of the perfect. Those who are perfect, at least in terms, not that they don't make mistakes. Perfection here is not understood as not making mistakes. I've often asked the question, maybe I've done it to this class already, I don't know. It's not a trick question, it's a serious question. How many of you believe Jesus made mistakes? I don't think it's thunderstorms outside, so you can feel free to raise your hand if you think he did. Sister Reen's the only brave person in here. Jesus made mistakes. Is it a sin to make a mistake? Good heavens. We say Jesus did not sin, right? But we do not say he did not make mistakes. Come on, you don't think he ever spilled a glass of milk? I mean, cut a piece of wood the wrong way for his father, bent a nail when he was nailing it in? Of course he did all that. That's. Yeah, he forgot to go home one time. Or forgot to tell them where he was going to be.
Broke curfew.
Yeah, that must have been a serious little situation. You wonder, Scripture doesn't tell all of what got discussed in that incident, does it? But listen to the description by Jordan Oman from the Theology of Perfection about these people. The unitive way is the way of those who are in the state of the perfect. That is, those who have their minds so drawn away from all temporal things. Now, it doesn't mean they're not involved with the world. They're just not caught up in it. That they enjoy great peace, who are neither agitated by various desires nor moved by any great extent by passion, and who have their minds chiefly fixed on God and their attention turned either always or very frequently to him. It is the union with God by love and the actual experience and exercise of that love. It is called the state of perfect charity, because souls who have reached that state are ever prompt in the exercise of charity by loving God habitually and by frequent and efficacious acts of that divine virtue. It is called the unitive way because it is by love that the soul is united to God. And the more perfect the charity, the closer and more intimate is the union. Union with God is the principal study and endeavor of this state. It is of this union that St. Paul speaks when he says, "He who is joined to the Lord is one spirit." St. John of the Cross would say, from now on there's only one thing to do, love. There's only to love. These are usually contemplatives, but they can seem like very ordinary people. To say that their lives are really governed by love rather than sin, notice what the opposite of sin is here. It's love. They're all the way on the other end of the continuum. They're not necessarily overly pious. They can seem quite ordinary, as I said, unpredictable, but very authentic. Those of you who saw the movie last night, Strike, I would suspect that woman would be a good example of someone in the unitive way. I mean, just the kind of virtue she exercised, the kind of courage and so forth. They are at peace with themselves, God, and the world. All shall be well in God's world is their attitude. Those are the three traditional stages. And if you're a spiritual director, you kind of try to get a sense of where your directee is in terms of these three traditional ways. That was certainly the case in monastic life when you were doing spiritual direction, and I still kind of have it in the back of my mind when I'm doing direction with people, although I have other ways of evaluating that in my mind as well. Questions or comments about this so far? Does this make sense? Moving from a life governed by sin to a stage where the will is needing to be exercised unto God and the emotions purified so that you can live more comfortably. In the illuminative stage, you can live more habitually in a virtuous manner, a loving manner, the Spirit enlightening your mind and directing your life. And finally, the unitive stage, you would say saints and mystics people that are good examples, they show us that this is possible. Their lives show us that. And as we know of saints and mystics, there's all kinds of people there, right? There's nothing to do with personality types, gender, race, anything like that. It has to do with their degree of surrender to God through time. It wouldn't be complete without mentioning the role of suffering here. It seems that suffering has a special role to play in helping people advance here, that suffering is the means by which our intent to God is purified and tested. And we learn that no matter what the suffering, nothing can separate us from the love of God poured out in Jesus Christ, not even the kind of suffering we're bearing. That draws us more and more. We cling to that conviction and are drawn more and more closer to God. Now here's a chart summarizing all of this in a different way, looking at it from another angle. The theme of the Purgative Way is reformation, reforming our way in the world, our old life. The theme of the Illuminative Way is confirmation with the life of Christ. The theme of the Unitive Way is transformation by the Spirit, transformation in Christ. The challenge of the Purgative Way is to discipline the passions, because we are still drawn back to those old ways. The challenge in the Illuminative Way is to clarify one's attitudes. In the Illuminative Way, we learn that our relationship with God can progress no further than our image of God or our conception of God. Do you believe that? So you have to get straight about that. Granted, God is not a concept and God is not an image. But we have a conception of God, an image of God, and an erroneous understanding of God can limit our relationship with God. And why is that? Because the will just cannot go where the mind won't also give permission. Our ongoing surrender to God depends to some extent on the mind being able to say, yes, that's okay, this is a good thing to do, because God is a good God. And the Unitive Way, the challenge or the work is this ongoing surrender. The passions have been tamed, and so the work of the Purgative Way is to practice virtue. In the Purgative stage, people need a lot of external discipline. If you're a spiritual director and you have someone in the Purgative stage, you direct them differently than you would someone in the Illuminative stage. You tell them you have to pray twice a day or once a day. You really make that known to be a non-negotiable. If you're going to grow in your life with God, you have to pray. Now, when are you going to do it? It's almost like coaching sometimes. It seems like more than spiritual direction. You try to get them to commit to external practices that they begin to value and that they begin to be more and more committed to and become a habitual part of their life, and so they don't even have to think about it anymore. I mean, I really like it when, someone reaches a stage where prayer is not something they have to even think about whether they're going to do or not. You just do it because it's part of your day. It's part of who you are. Like taking a shower or eating breakfast. You pray. Illuminative Way, you continue to practice virtue, of course, in all of these stages, but the examen and discernment are very important. You're really clarifying your attitudes here. And the Unitive stage is about abiding in God, making time for that, just to be with God, to rest in God. Prayer in the Purgative Way is active and discursive to a large part. People in the Purgative Way have a great deal of difficulty doing something like centering prayer. When they come into prayer, their experience is the mind going all over the place, this way and that. The thoughts are flying around. It's very difficult to focus on God in a contemplative prayer method. They can try it and they'll probably get some benefit out of it, but it's much more important for them to spend time with the Word, doing something like Lectio Divina, even vocal prayer. And these are not inferior forms of prayer. People in the Unitive stage continue to do those kinds of prayer, but they're probably the best forms of prayer for people in the Purgative stage. In the Illuminative stage, one can begin to be introduced to very simplified discursive forms of prayer. Discursive means you're using your mind and you're using words and things like that. Discourse or discourse. And so centering prayer and contemplative prayer methods like that work a little better for people who are more recollected, such as you find in the Illuminative way. Finally, the Unitive way, prayer is usually more simple and contemplative, just a being with God, but these people generally still pray the Liturgy of the Hours or do Lectio Divina, and of course they go to liturgy with the community and things like that. In terms of St. Teresa's interior castle, the purgative stage is the first 3 levels of the castle, so she divides this up. Those in the first castle are having a very difficult time. But by the time you get to castle number 3, it's a little easier. She refines this understanding more. Have any of you read her book, The Interior Castle? It's quite readable and still got great wisdom to communicate to us, I believe. She's talking to sisters mostly, but you get what she's saying. Illuminative stage is 4 and 5, Unitive 6 and 7. The fruit of the purgative stage is humility, this deepening understanding of who one is, the self-knowledge that Sister Jane talked about. Equanimity, more being sort of level, not having the emotions. In the illuminative stage, the fruit is recollection, this sense of being connected with God in your mind and will, and a sense of knowing who you are, not just as a reflection of your own self-concept, which is where we get our idea of ourselves most often, but of knowing something of who we are in God, beginning to awaken to what we might call the true self. And in the unitive stage, the fruit is charity and the fruits of the Spirit. Okay. So, a few notes about all this. These stages are generalizations, and there is overlap. So, for example, one could be, let's say, one's issues could be 50% purgative, 30% illuminative, and 20% unitive. You're not all the way in one stage completely, although if you're just coming out of, let's say, a very worldly life, where your life is caught up in kind of sinful involvement, your issues might be 100% purgative for quite a while. Now that's starting off again with a person who's just, let's say, grown up and not known anything about God and been really caught up in a sinful lifestyle. But obviously that's not the case with many of us who grew up knowing about God, being taught about God, going to church and praying and so forth. We could have been in the purgative stage as little children and moving into the illuminative stage as teenagers and children as well. So we're still going through these stages, but it looks different for children than it would for an adult who's coming out of a very sinful lifestyle. Then as one grows, the percentages might shift. So we might say that a person in the unitive stage still has 10% being caught up in some purgative stage issues. They're mostly okay, but they still have to really watch it when they're on the internet because of pornography. They still have to be really careful about that. Or going to a bar, or going to any place where there's partying and drinking. They got to be on their toes. They can't take it for granted that they're done with that. They might be 10, 30, 60 in the way their issues spread out. But they're mostly in the unitive stage, and they enjoy that. And if they keep growing there, then their issues will become less and less caught in the purgative and illuminative. The dark nights that we put up there was largely John of the Cross's scheme. They can be severe, they can be long or short, they can overlap, even be reversed at times. If you think you know what's going to happen next in a dark night, it's probably the opposite that will happen. But it is important to recognize dark nights as transition times, as important transition times, which is again why we have a Spirit Life class that will be dedicated for that. There really is growth, and that is one thing that the 3 ways or stages are saying. There really is growth happening in the spiritual life, and we can say something about it. There really are challenges that are overcome. When I asked you earlier to think about something that has changed in your life in God in the last 10 or 20 years, you probably got in touch with that. You might say, I used to be so impatient about this, and now it doesn't bother me at all. There really is increasing peace. There really is a recovery of freedom, which is foundational for love. All along the way, there are temptations and falls. We can never take it for granted that we are through with sin. Even those in the unitive way can fall at times, and they do. We are all radically dependent on God's grace to be united with God. The old saying goes, even the greatest of saints falls 7 times a day. But it's a good reminder. Through this process, one's basic temperament and natural talents are not lost. You notice this, for example, in the scriptures with Saul, who becomes Paul. Essentially the same kind of temperament and personality before his conversion as after. He's passionately persecuting the Christians because he thinks they're wrong and the Jewish teaching is correct and these Christians are heretics. And after his conversion, he's passionately trying to convert the world to Christianity because he's convinced that this is the truth and the way. It's the same guy, only he's got a different message and he's been transformed now. So we continue to be, and actually, in fact, become, through this process, the unique person that God has created us to be. All right, let's look at this in terms now of this external locus of control, internal locus of control, and there on the ego-God line, we've put sinner, purgative, illuminative, unitive. I'm going to put 3 lines up here and ask you to say something about them. Okay, there's one line, and I don't know if you can see that's the color green. And here's a red line and a blue line. Now I'll give you a little time at your table, just 3 or 4 minutes, to say something about each of these lines and tell me about these people. Tell me about Greenie, Reddy, and Bluey here. A little something about their lives, just looking at this trajectory we put up here, okay? Let's see how that goes. Okay, tell me about green. Anyone come to mind when you look at green?
Oh, I thought the green line meant that it was eco-friendly, agreeing with the universe and being kind to it.
Okay, how about in terms of the stages though? Green begins life in the unitive stage. You notice that? And continues to grow, however, in terms of stages of ego development as a normal human growth pattern. Now, who could that be? Jesus. Think of Jesus. That would be one way of understanding Jesus, that he's born in the unitive stage in this sense here. His will and God's will are completely joined. And yet he undergoes a normal human developmental process. These stages of ego development. And he's not ready for his public ministry until he reaches a certain level of maturity. See that? And you might say that, theologically Catholics would make that affirmation about Mary. You might even make it about Adam and Eve. Just a thought, right? Okay, now tell me about Mr. Red here. Average Joe. We had a person at our table who said he's trying. He is. What's happening with Mr. Red?
He's headed for bottom.
Yeah,
He's going to bottom out at some point. He's not bottomed out yet.
Yeah, he hasn't quite bottomed out yet. And let's hope that the line doesn't end here at death, because he's on the wrong side of the line. At least in St. Teresa's schema, he's outside the castle. His life is still governed by sin. Of course, that doesn't have anything to do with God's love, but it has to do with his reception of God's love. Everything to do with that. So, yeah, he's born like we all are, sort of outside the castle, but comes in, goes out, comes in, goes out. We hope he gets back in and stays, right? And what about Blue?
Thomas Merton, although it needs to go higher. Blue has to keep going up.
Well, I don't know if blue is Merton. Do you think blue is Merton?
I think it could be a lot of people.
It could be,
Starts
yeah.
out lower, but advances rather rapidly, and his line needs to continue. I think he went further in his life before, but he did start down, with being pretty lost,
Yeah.
and he made a very rapid progression up. That's why I thought of him.
Blue's kind of getting it, though, right?
Oh, definitely getting it.
Yeah, blue's,
Oh, sure.
Blue's got it, right.
And yet that goes higher, I think, ultimately.
Yes, sure, it can keep going higher. Yeah, now what would be fun, how about if you draw your own line for your own life? That could be a homework assignment. I'm not going to ask you to share it with others, but it'd be a good reflection for you to share, maybe with your spiritual director. Say, oh, have I got something to show you today? At some point we do talk about your faith journey. This would be a great way to share it, right? Draw your faith journey in terms of this graph, in terms of Levenger's stages of spiritual development and Purgative, Illuminative, Unitive way. And your spiritual director will be most impressed if you come prepared to do that.